Okay, welcome back everybody. So this is just going to be a quick video showing some of the technical details of a Heckscher-Ohlin model, also known as a standard model of international trade, also known as a 2x2x2 model. Perhaps the most commonly utilized basis for modeling international trade and predicting or forecasting patterns of trade. There are some, well, we'll just leave this the technical part of it, all right? The more theoretical details as well as the usability or functionability of this model will cover in the regular videos. Okay. So moving forward, right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my cursor here, right? So the cursor on the screen over there. Let's do that. There we go. The cursor. So when I'm looking at the graphs, I'm going to be using the cursor to illustrate as we move through this. This is going to be a short video, right? Okay, and I'm going to move quickly. So pause, rewind, you get it. All right, so first of all, here are the assumptions of a Heckscher-Ohlin model. It is important to understand that these assumptions, right, this determines the applicability of the model, right? So to the degree at which the assumptions are valid, the model is applicable. They're not valid, then it's not applicable. There's really two super important things to take away from this, in addition to just knowing all these, right? But you should know these two super important things off the top of your head. One, Heckscher-Ohlin model is about illustrating gains from trade and predicting patterns of trade based upon factor allocations. And the second thing is you should understand is that so whereas a Ricardian model is based upon productivity differences, right? So you're predicting patterns of trade based upon relative productivities. Here we're going to assume that productivities can equalize through what? Through technology transfer. So Heckscher-Ohlin model allows for technology transfer from nation A to nation B. So it goes a step further in that sense from a Ricardian model. Allows for plants, you know, like things like know-how, right, education, how to build the machine, you know, that kind of stuff can move from country to country. And so in that step, it sets as sort of a step up. You know, might say, okay, well, trade happens. Okay, productivity is, oh, but there was no more productivity differences. Why is trade still okay? Heckscher-Ohlin model. All right. So with that, let's hop right into the graphs and whatnot. So the pre-trade situation in a Heckscher-Ohlin style model is going to look something like this. So we have some PPF in this case for country 2, right? So this is the PPF for country 2. We can see that it's can produce relatively more of good G when compared to good A, and the country 1's PPF looks like this right here, right? And so it seems that they can produce relatively more of good A than good B. Now, the reason for that is because the factor endowment, right? So we're going to, from this, it follows that good A uses one of the factors of production, either labor or capital. And let's say that good A is labor abundant. So it uses, labor intensive. This PPF would imply that then this country, country 1, is labor abundant, right? So the reason why this country can produce a lot of good A is because good A uses labor and they have a lot of labor. And so labor is cheap in country 1 relative to country 2. Okay. Country 2 has the reverse scenario, and again, these don't need to be absolute like they're shown there, right? It can be relative, just like in a Ricardian model. So good G appears to have the opposite intensity, right? So good G perhaps is capital intensive, and the way these PPFs are drawn suggests that good country 2 is relatively well endowed or has a lot of capital relative to country 1, and as a consequence of that, they can produce a relatively large amount of good G. All right. Now you'll notice that if we were to draw utility indifference curves, and we were to trace the tangencies at the current consumption to each of these PPFs, and if both countries have the same taste and preferences, then it must be the case that relative prices, it's just mathematically, it has to be the case, right? that relative prices in good country 1 are not going to be the same as in good country 2, right? And we can see that illustrated here. The slope of this price line is noticeably different from this price line. Okay, we notice that good A is relatively what? It's relatively cheaper when compared to good G in country 1 compared to country 2, right? Why? Country 1 can produce a lot of good A, and so it's relatively cheap before trade, right? It's cheap to produce relative to the other thing because they have a lot of that factor of production. Okay, so pre-trade in a Heckscher-Ohlin model, it has to be the case that there are price variations and that those price variations between the countries arise due to different factor endowments. Okay, so again, PPFs, relative prices in each country pre-trade. As trade opens up, what happens, of course, is prices equalize, right? Law of one price. If there's only one market produces one price for one good. And so what we would expect to happen is for nations to specialize in areas of relative comparative advantage. That is to say, where they can produce at lower opportunity costs. Okay, so we would expect for country 1, which appears to be located on the right here now, okay, country 1 to begin producing more of the Y good, which is now labeled as cars, okay, and less of the X good, which is labeled as textiles. Conversely, country 2, right, which is now labeled as Mexico, we would expect to be producing more textiles, or the X good, and less of cars, or the Y good. All right. Now, of course, as prices equalize, right, that is what's causing the change in production, right? So as the price of, so moving back to this arrangement here, pre-trade arrangement, we know that the price of a good G relative to good Y is going to fall in country 1. And the reverse is going to be the case in country 2, okay, because prices are going to equalize. So the thing that's expensive pre-trade is going to get cheaper, and the thing that's cheap pre-trade is going to get more expensive in each country, okay, until the price ratios equalize across the countries. Okay, now when we draw those new tangencies at the global price, which is reflected here, this line here, this dark red line, and this other dark red line here, which have the same slope because they're the same price ratio. When we draw those tangencies with those same slopes, what we find is that we are producing at points E prime and lowercase e prime here. So those are our production points. Our pre-trade production points were E and E. So pre-trade production, post-trade production. Okay, that allows us then to consume outside of the PPF through trade, right? So we can consume more than we can produce domestically because we're producing some goods and services that we can produce cheaply. We're shipping them abroad and exchanging them for goods that would have been more expensive for us to produce, a la, Ricardian model, right? So when we sketch the tangencies to the indifference curves, illustrated here and here by the dark blue lines, okay, we find that with these tastes and preferences, this country, Mexico, ends up consuming at point C prime, and this country, US, ends up consuming at lowercase c prime. Okay, noting that, of course, both those consumption choices are outside of what would have been possible without trade. So the degree to which we're off the PPF then is the degree to which there are total gains from trade. Okay, we can furthermore use a simplified version of these graphs illustrated here, right? So we've just gotten rid of a lot of the extra lines, and we can then look at local production, local consumption, and determine the quantity of exports and imports from each nation, as well as the predicted pattern of trade. So country on the left here is importing this vertical distance and exporting this horizontal distance. Country B on the right hand over here is exporting the vertical distance, which corresponds to what? those imports, right? These exports are those imports. They're the same stuff, right? This is when they go on the ship. This is when they come off the ship. Okay, and same here. This is when they go on the ship, and this is when they come off the ship. Okay, so it's the same stuff, right? Illustrated in both countries. And so in sum, what we end up in a HO model predicting is that HO tells us that if nations specialize in areas of relative factor abundance, they'll be specializing in areas of relative comparative advantage. So a nation that has, say, a lot of labor is going to export labor-intensive goods. Okay? And a country that has a lot of capital relative to other countries is going to export a lot of capital-intensive goods. That's sort of the lesson of a Heckscher-Ohlin model. All right, that's it. Told you I'd keep this one short. See you next time.